Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, drill baby drill.
The drilling industry has come up with some of the most creative job titles.
Yeah. Tell me more.
You could imagine. Tool pusher.
No.
Driller. Motorman. Mudlogger. These are all job titles when you're out on a drilling site.
And without one of them, you can't get the work done.
You need everybody.
I recently caught up with Tim Latimer, CEO of Fervo, a geothermal startup. And we got talking about the folksy flair of oil and gas industry job titles. Because he is hiring. And the geothermal plants he is building requires the expertise of the mudlogger and the motorman, among others. Geothermal power works by sending water to hot rocks underground, using that heat to run a turbine, which creates electricity. This kind of geothermal power has been around for more than a century. What Tim is doing is a little bit different. Fervo was founded in 2017, and it uses fracking technology from the oil and gas industry to supercharge geothermal power plants.
You know, drilling in a lot of ways is drilling. If you're a phenomenal driller for oil and gas, you're going to do very well in geothermal. And so it does create this great opportunity for us to tap into that skill set.
Fervo opened its first power plant in Nevada late in 2023, and the company is quickly growing. It raised $220 million in February and is now in the process of opening another plant in Utah. The way to get to zero emissions is to electrify as much of our world as possible and produce that electricity without emissions. Now, solar and wind power are solving that problem, but only partially because they aren't available all the time. Geothermal power is near zero emissions and is available all the time. Geothermal has been around for longer than modern solar or wind power. But until Fervo came along, I hadn't seen its true potential. Iceland was a developing country before it found a way to tap geothermal power. And that kind of story could play out in Kenya, Indonesia, and so many other developing countries. Geothermal power can also solve the problem of intermittent solar and wind in developed countries. I caught up with Tim at the Breakthrough Energy Summit in London earlier this summer. We talked about the history of geothermal, the challenges of making it work today, and his plans to build plants outside the US. Tim, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Now, there's a long history of people using geothermal energy, from indigenous people making use of hot springs to spa towns like Bath here in England. People love using naturally heated water for rest and restoration. But the first experiments in capturing that geothermal heat to make it into electricity happened in early 1900s. The first project, which happened in Italy, was just enough power to light 4 light bulbs. So let's talk about geothermal plants and how do they work.
Yeah, that Italian project was pioneering just because it showed that you could use the natural heat of the earth to create electricity. And I'll point out, even though it was only 4 light bulbs were not as efficient back then. So still a great proof point, but relatively small. And I think what was interesting about that project is that it accessed the site in Italy that geologically was so productive from a geothermal standpoint that the steam was naturally coming out of the ground. And so there actually wasn't even any drilling involved. And you see that there are places in the world where steam will naturally escape the surface. But as we move forward with geothermal, the number of locations where steam is just pouring out of the ground is not that numerous. And so you started seeing some pioneering approaches in Iceland, New Zealand, United States that looked at, okay, if steam isn't coming out of the ground, but we could drill a little bit down into the ground, could we access more productive steam deposits? So you saw a ramp up, in the 60s and 70s of that technology is combining that surface, capturing steam to generate electricity using a turbine technology with drilling. And so the oldest forms of geothermal electricity generation were just going to these really naturally productive areas, drilling relatively shallow wells, and then using the steam to directly power a turbine.
And so it went from sort of kilowatts, which would power today a home or two homes, to megawatts, but only tens of megawatts initially, right?
Yeah, but it started to expand. The largest geothermal facility in the world is the geysers in Northern California, and it really started getting built out in the 70s and 80s, and at one point reached over 2 gigawatts of power. So relatively early on, in these specific locations with really suitable geology, geothermal scale to be a pretty meaningful part of the electricity mix. But it was always only narrowly applicable into these locations with perfect geology.
And then the drilling technology itself. Initially, you could drill and tap into reservoirs that had steam. But after that, you had to start drilling two wells and pour water in, heat it up, and bring it back up.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, we really always should have been doing that. It's just the first sites that people develop in these great locations, there just seemed to be an endless amount of steam that would come out of the ground. So actually, to talk more specifically about that project in the geysers in Northern California, it actually peaked in the 80s at 2.2 gigawatts. And for 20 years of development, you drill more wells, you get more power, and everything seemed to be working just fine. But actually, one of the things that was happening is there were multiple developers all tapping into the same steam resource and producing, but not actually providing the right reinjection of fluid. And so after about 20 years of production, the field started to decline and decline quite rapidly. So by the mid 90s, it had declined to only about 1 gigawatt of production. But in that time, people figured out that you really did need to not just produce hot steam out of production wells, but re-inject cold water back down using injection wells to make sure you could maintain the reservoir over time. So they started a re-injection project at the geysers in the 90s, and it's actually been very stable since then, producing roughly 1 gigawatt of electricity. But from then on, I think the importance of making sure that you weren't just producing steam, but actually re-injecting cold water back into the reservoir to maintain it, became standard practice in the industry.
And what you've been able to do with Fervo, where you apply oil and gas technology, the horizontal drilling, to be able to access more heat from these areas, expands the capacity of energy and thus power that you could produce from the same sites. So when you apply that lens that this technology is now viable, you've actually built plants that produce power. Does that fundamentally change the potential for geothermal in the world?
Yes.
And by how much?
By orders of magnitude. So, even though geothermal's been around for a long time, you look at a market like the United States today, and it's still 0.4% of the electricity mix. And the reason for that is that the geysers is wildly productive. Other sites in California are wildly productive. There's been new technology that's opened up projects in Oregon and Nevada and elsewhere, but it's still been limited historically to these areas that have very specific geologic criteria. It has to be really hot. It has to be hot close to the surface. You don't have to drill that deep. And there has to be natural permeability in the reservoir so that you could get high flow rates out of the wells.
And natural permeability just means that when you inject water, that it naturally flows through the geology, because it's not like there's a tank there. It's
right.
Sort of rocks that are porous and you need the water to naturally flow through them.
Exactly right. And that's a very locally specific criteria for the rock that really depends on what rock type it is and what geologic setting it's in. And so what people found is that sometimes you would drill a geothermal well and it would produce a lot of steam. And sometimes you would drill a geothermal well and it would produce no steam. And that was by and large because there were areas that, even though we knew the rocks were hot and hot enough to provide temperatures that were viable for commercial development of geothermal, you couldn't get the flow rates needed. So going back even to the 1970s, the Department of Energy in the US started working on techniques to look at, okay, let's say not every site's the geysers, because the geysers is pretty unique, but let's say you have to drill deeper and you have to create your own flow pathways as opposed to relying on natural ones. If that works, you start talking about a geothermal resource that isn't, 0.4%, but could be a factor of 100 times, more than that. The potential is, for all intents and purposes, limitless. But going to deeper levels and then using the well stimulation techniques to create your permeability, even when there's not natural permeability, is something that adds significant cost. And so even though everyone always knew the resource potential was massive, and there's been experiments on what we call enhanced geothermal systems going back to the 1970s, and there have been many experiments all over the world since then, it never met the right cost criteria. And so geothermal was not able to expand beyond just those niche resources that had the perfect geology, up until very recently.
So going back to Fervo, the thing that you are able to do uniquely is open up existing places that did not have the flow rate, the permeability, and make them work through these techniques developed in the oil and gas industry around hydraulic fracturing, and produce power in a new way. Let's start with your first plant that was built in Nevada. It started producing power late in 2023. What was the challenge that you had to face, and what did you learn from doing it?
Yeah, so we wanted to be able to prove that the new thing we were bringing to enhanced geothermal systems, which is actually the incorporation of horizontal drilling, would lead to the transformative outcomes we were expecting when it came to the metrics that make these projects viable, mostly flow rate and cost. And so we started looking for a site that had very specific criteria. What we wanted to find was an existing geothermal power plant, because when we drilled the wells, we wanted to be able to start producing brine for electricity immediately. And we wanted to find a place that was underperforming so it could support our brine. And we also wanted to find a place that was underperforming specifically because in its initial development, it only used conventional drilling technology and had dry holes. And so we found a project in northern Nevada that met all those criteria. It was developed about 15 years ago and never quite made it to its full potential because they actually had drilled, 20 plus wells at this site, but found that roughly half the wells were dry holes. And so we cited an area of the field where, going back 15 years ago, there'd been 4 conventional vertical geothermal wells drilled, all unsuccessful. And we decided to put our pilot project right in that spot because we thought, what better way of showing a like-for-like comparison of what our technology can do than providing a productive project in a place that's exactly where a previously unsuccessful project had been. And so we located to an area that was to the south of an existing geothermal field, but was proven to be, sub-commercial using conventional drilling technology. And we started a program that involved drilling 3 wells. First, a vertical monitoring well that we could instrument with fiber optics and other sensors so that we could really learn a lot more about this project since it was a pilot project. And then we drilled the first pair of horizontal wells ever drilled in the geothermal industry. And so drilling horizontally for us, what we did at that site is we drilled vertically down to a depth of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 feet. And we get to that depth because that's where the temperature gets above 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is prospective for geothermal production. And then we turn the bit sideways and drill horizontally for 3,000 feet. And we did this with 2 different wells that we sited a few hundred feet apart from each other. And so what that means is rather than just a couple of vertical wells and the flow going directly between 2 points and these small vertical wells, we were actually able to create over 100 different flow zones between these 2 horizontal wells that are 8,000 feet down and run parallel to each other for 3,000 feet. And so what that creates is a situation where we can pump down the injection well and actually distribute the flow evenly across a 3,000 foot area. And so it's far more efficient for heat transfer and picking up the heat, and also importantly accesses a much bigger resource so the project can last a lot longer. And then that water sweeps across the reservoir, collects the heat, and comes back up our production well that we then send to the plant to generate electricity.
And now you have a new announcement that with Southern California Edison, you're going to be building another geothermal plant. This one's going to be a lot bigger. And this came about in part because of a new rule from California's regulators, which to my mind is a good example of how governments and private companies have to coordinate in this energy transition. As I understand it, the state of California is requiring energy utilities to procure 1 gigawatt of clean energy by 2026. What made geothermal provider like Fervo so attractive compared to, say, wind or solar?
Yeah, it's a great question, and also a great point about the important role of policy in deploying new technologies. We formed the company in 2017 and knew that California, especially given their emphasis on climate action, was going to be a great market for us. But one thing we found as we started engaging with the power buyers of the load serving entities in California is actually very few of them had experience in procurement of geothermal. It's a very different technology than wind or solar or natural gas that they're a lot more familiar with. And even the ones that did have experience, often hadn't negotiated those contracts in a long time. So it was actually very difficult to engage in an offtake discussion with them because, You could talk about cost and risk and reliability and these things and the environmental attributes, these things that the power buyers care a lot about. But, if they're not staffed or motivated to evaluate geothermal projects, then it could be hard for a new technology like geothermal to break through. And so one of the important things that happened is, really two things. One, on the climate ambition side, is SB 100 passed in California about 5 years ago. And California had been very successful in meeting their initial renewable portfolio standard targets. But those, like most of the renewable portfolio standard targets in the United States, typically targeted lower levels of renewable energy penetration, 10%, 20%, 30%. But it wasn't until about 5 years ago that people started getting very serious about full decarbonization, 100% clean electricity mix. And SB 100 in California really created a great vision for strong intermediate targets for decarbonization in the next decade, and then ultimately a target of complete decarbonization of the electricity sector by 2045. And so that was the first sort of wake-up call, I think, to the power buyers in the state that, okay, we really need to build on the success of wind and solar deployment and start thinking about energy storage and clean firm power to really make sure we can achieve those goals of 100% decarbonization.
So it's easy to understand that geothermal is not like solar and wind because you can access geothermal all the time. It's hard to understand why it's not like natural gas because you're still using a steam turbine, you're still spinning a turbine to produce power, and you can produce it when you want it, just like a natural gas power plant. So why is it that utilities couldn't understand geothermal as they understand gas?
It's similar from an output standpoint, but the technology is very different. And when utilities procure especially large contracts of power, they build really detailed integrated resource plans around that. So it's very important if they procure the power that it actually shows up. And traditionally, if they were going to diligence, a natural gas project, they need to make sure that the technology is valid, that they've got the right engineering plans, it has access to natural gas and a feed supply agreement so that the power can get the fuel. And, you could sort of check the boxes on that and understand that, all right, this project has a reasonable likelihood of success. When they started looking at geothermal, now if you're a utility and you want to base your planning on this resource showing up, you need to understand a lot more about that technology. Like you need to really have confidence that the developer proposing the project can actually drill the wells and get the resource output needed to be successful. And unfortunately, using conventional technology of geothermal, there's been many examples over the last several decades of people with great plans of projects and ambitions that ran into that dry hole challenge. And as a result, the projects didn't show up on time or didn't produce as much as they were intending to. And so when you're talking to a utility customer that really needs to make sure a project is going to show up when they contract it, the fact that they didn't have comfort around the track record of success in geothermal. Not a lot of utilities have a geology department sitting around, and so they just didn't really feel comfortable with taking on the development risk that is inherent to geothermal using conventional technology.
And so what did you have to do to convince Southern California Edison to take on geothermal then?
Yeah, well, there's another part of the resource, policy mix in California. So SB 100 was very powerful in setting the climate ambition. But then the rolling blackouts that occurred in the state in August of 2020, were a real wake-up call for making sure that reliability was a focus of the grid. And so the California Public Utility Commission issued a ruling called the Midterm Reliability Ruling that spelled out specific procurement mandates for capacity and for energy storage to make sure that California could meet its reliability goals. But also there was an early recognition there that wind, solar, and batteries were going to get a lot of the job done, but we are going to need an additional resource that's a clean firm power solution. And clean firm is the definition of technologies that don't produce carbon emissions, but also have dispatchability and are on all the time. So like geothermal, nuclear, natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. Those are sort of the technologies that people generally bucket into the clean firm power mix. And so the CPUC actually created a specific carve out for 1,000 megawatts of clean firm power. And so it, for the first time in a long time, created a strong market signal that this was something that the grid needs. A well-functioning grid needs to have a portion of its energy come from clean firm power. And it pushed that mandate out actually to all of the power buyers in the state of California. So all of a sudden they had a reason to make sure that they could get smart about projects and look at geothermal. So we engaged with a lot of community choice aggregators and the specific utilities in California. They all ran oftentimes their first proposals to procure geothermal power in decades, in some cases, or for the first time ever for a lot of these organizations. And we had been building since 2017 a portfolio of projects that we could market to these customers that, could meet the online date obligations of the Public Utility Commission's requirements. So we first engaged with SCE for this deal as part of a procurement process to meet those needs. And we were able to show, not only had we done the groundwork on the permitting and transmission and siting of projects, but that in parallel to that, we'd accomplished all of the technical objectives needed at Project Red, our project in Nevada. And so we were viewed by them and by our other customers as a technology that meets the needs of this clean, firm power mandate, helps support California meet not only its climate goals, but its reliability goals, and actually could prove that we were a technology with a track record of success and the ability to scale up quickly in time to meet these mandates. And I think we're fairly unique in our ability to do that. So we found a lot of success in the offtake market now because there's market demand for what we're selling. And we've also gone through the steps of de-risking the technology to show that we're ready to scale to meet the need of the grid in the very near term.
So now you're working on a project in Utah. It's going to be 400 megawatts, and that could power something like 300,000 homes. It's going to be an expensive project because it's a first of a kind at that scale for you. Just talk us through the financing. How are you going to make it work?
Yeah, great question. Because I think the first of a kind project deployment and financing is I think the important topic when it comes to climate tech deployment today. Because it's an area that we as a financing ecosystem haven't really solved well before. When you think about traditional renewable project finance with wind and solar, which are very proven technologies, a lot of times once you kind of check the boxes of development in terms of siting and engineering and customer offtake, you can already bring in very high percentages of debt for the project. So that's one of the things that makes these technologies very affordable is the financing costs are very low.
Right. And debt comes in cheap because debt is a loan from typically a bank or maybe some investors, and they'll charge you an interest rate, but it's typically lower interest rate than you would pay if you raise that money through equity, where they're looking for 10, 12, 15% return.
Absolutely. And so when you think about Fervo and deploying our geothermal technology, or really anything that's in the climate tech deployment phase, people understand that the first project or the second project or even the 10th project, you have less of a track record. And so investors want to see the potential for a higher return to compensate them for the risk they're taking on, because they may have a couple projects in that portfolio with their first of a kind projects that just don't return anything. And so early projects are going to have a high cost of capital. And then the goal is to build a track record of success so you can progressively lower that cost of capital.
And so to do this, you're splitting this project into a 100 megawatt plant and then upgrade to a 400 megawatt plant.
That's right.
So how much is the first 100 megawatt going to cost, and when does it come online?
Yeah, so phase one of this project, we call it Project Cape in Utah, will be roughly 100 megawatts. At this point in time, we've already drilled several of the wells. We've done all of the work to develop and bring it online on our schedule, which is set for 2026. And we'll spend over $500 million to bring that first phase of that project online by 2026.
And some of it will come from debt.
Yes. So the goal for us or any technology is to get to where these projects are so trusted because of your track record that you can finance them with a high degree of debt. We've checked a lot of the boxes for traditional project development. We're very far along in the engineering. We've already drilled half the well field. We've got offtake. We've got transmission. We've got the permits we need. But since it's viewed as a newer technology, we have to get a much lower percentage of debt compared to if it was a more proven technology. So in the industry, we call this, over-equitizing a project. When you're a mature technology with a binding offtake agreement, you would hope to get 50% or more of the project from debt. On our first project, we're looking at more like 20 to 30% from debt. And that's great. It helps us finance the project. But as we build more of a track record, we'll be able to finance a higher percentage of the project with debt and then translate that into lower cost electricity for our customers.
But it's also true that it's taken you a long time to get the permits. And these days, at least in the US, but also in Europe, building anything is taking a long time. Getting planning and permits done is taking a long time. Are there specific hurdles for geothermal projects?
Yes. So it's a bit of a quirk of history or geology or whatever you would call it, that the best locations in the United States for geothermal energy development also happen to be on land that's owned by the US federal government. And federal land carries with it very different permitting requirements than private or state land. The majority of our projects are sited on federal land because that's where the geology is the best. The vast majority of the Western United States is owned by the federal government, and the vast majority of the Western United States is where the best geothermal projects are. And so for us to be able to break ground on our Project Cape and drill the first well, which we did in the summer of 2023, we actually started the leasing and permitting process for that project back in 2019. So it took us about 4 years to get the project in position to be able to drill the first well. And a lot of that is an artifact of the fact that it's on federal land. If it was just on private land, you could probably shorten that to 6 or 12 months. And it's particularly challenging for geothermal because not only are we developing projects mostly on federal land where we're subject to these requirements, but also there's actually a lot of categorical exclusions that make permitting easier for drilling in the United States that only apply to oil and gas drilling. And so we have many examples where going through our project development, if we were to call it an oil and gas project, or if we were drilling for oil and gas, we could actually streamline the permitting to go a lot faster. But those categorical exclusions don't extend to geothermal development.
You don't have the lobbying power, man.
It's not the lobbying power. And it's also something that, geothermal always struggles to be top of mind for people. I think there's been a long-standing conventional wisdom that it's a great resource, but it can't scale. And so people haven't really focused on it for policy efforts. So, that shows up in the fact that for much of the last decade, we didn't have the same tax credit that solar and wind did. And that makes it challenging to develop. It also shows up in the permitting side where, I've talked to people who were in the room when the provisions of the Energy Act of 2005 that put in these categorical exclusions for oil and gas drilling were developed. And I asked, why did you exclude geothermal? And the obvious answer is nobody had anything against geothermal. It's very obvious the environmental impacts of drilling for geothermal are actually less than the environmental impacts of drilling for oil and gas. It just didn't come up, And so if the law was specific to oil and gas drilling, and nobody thought to include geothermal, that's the situation we landed ourselves in. And that's something that we find over and over again, not just in the US market, but internationally, is you're set up with policy structures that didn't really contemplate rapid growth of geothermal. And that's one of the barriers to deployment.
You are using hydraulic fracturing, which was a technology that was pursued and supported heavily by the US government for specifically oil and gas industry. Now, we've been using fracking for a long time, and it's been pretty productive for gas, even for oil. But there have been issues around fracking that are very specific to how it's done, right? You use a lot of fluids to try and break these geological structures in a very specific way. You cause earthquakes. Do any of those problems also translate to what you're doing when you try and get geothermal power from fracking?
Yeah, as with any development project, there are risks that we have to address and handle through the development process. One of the concerns you raised is what we in the industry call induced seismicity. Is there subsurface activity that you can do that can cause earthquakes? And what we do is quite a bit different from the oil and gas industry. Actually, when you review the majority of the earthquake activity that's associated with shale oil and gas development in the United States, the most common events come from saltwater disposal wells. It's actually all the produced water that's generated from the operations that then has to get re-injected as a disposal into these wells that can cause pressure changes that can trigger these earthquake activities. And so we actually don't, have that as part of our process. After we finish drilling and completing the wells, all we're actually doing then for an extended period of time is recirculating the fluid through the reservoir. And so that actually doesn't cause these pressure changes that disposal wells do. And so it doesn't present the same high level of risk for seismic activity that the oil and gas industry has. So I would say, even though it doesn't carry a lot of the same inherent risks, it's still something we focus on quite a bit. So in the United States, the Department of Energy has outlined a protocol called the Induced Seismicity Mitigation Protocol for geothermal that actually walks through what are the steps that you need to take for, safe development of geothermal power. So We follow all of those steps in the protocol for every one of our projects. And to give you some examples of what that means, we actually partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey on our first project. We analyzed that the seismic monitoring network in our area wasn't really robust enough to get the really high fidelity measurements we wanted to get to meet the induced seismicity protocols. So we actually partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey to augment, and we installed 7 local seismic monitoring stations around our project so that we could monitor for levels of seismicity. And what we know from years and years of development in geothermal and oil and gas and elsewhere is actually larger seismic events that could cause risks to people are always preceded by smaller seismic events that can be picked up with specialized instrumentation but can't be felt at the surface. And so part of the protocol for induced seismicity and geothermal is the adoption of what we call a traffic light system, where we actually set very low thresholds for these augmented seismic networks. The specialized sensor can detect low levels of seismic activity. We can actually pause operations until the seismic activity subsides. And as a result, you can really mitigate against those risks of higher activity. So what we do, obviously borrows technology from oil and gas, but it's both different technically. The example I gave here is we're not using those disposal wells, but it's also something that we have a lot of tools to mitigate against. And we have not had any issues with seismicity.
Now, with all of that context in mind, you are dreaming big. You want the US generation from geothermal to go from 0.4% to 20%. Now, if you're not dreaming big as a startup, you're not doing right. So it's nice to have a big dream, but this is going to happen at a time where electricity demand is likely going to double. So you're really thinking of scaling geothermal 100 times from where it is. What will it take to make that jump happen?
Yeah, so I think we need to build on our early pilot success. I think the fact that we have a project online and producing energy is something that, honestly differentiates us a lot in the climate tech ecosystem. A lot of companies have not got across that important milestone yet, but our next goal is to prove that we can do it at 100 times the scale. And that's this 400 megawatt project. And then as we think going forward, the nice thing about our technology, as we've discussed, is it really does open up so much more sites to potential development. So we actually have a pipeline just in the Western United States where we have dozens of other projects we've cited and identified locations for that are just as big, if not bigger, than our current 400 megawatt project. And so what we need to do is bring this 400 megawatt project online, show that this is a reliable, proven, cost-effective technology, and then scale the growth rate 10 or 100 times so that we can achieve those goals. So there's really no limit to the amount of geothermal potential. And it just comes down to how much of it can be accessed economically with today's technology.
Now, we've been talking about the US because the US is the place with the most geothermal power in the world. But there is a lot of geothermal power capacity in developing countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Kenya. If anything, over the past 2 decades, Kenya has been able to build geothermal, and now almost 50% of its power comes from geothermal. Are you looking to expand Fervo outside the US, and where?
Yes, definitely. I think all of our current projects in construction are in the US. And that's because we see market demand for that. We understand that market. We're a US-based company. And so that's where we wanted to start. But the technologies we're working on are globally applicable. The US is the market leader in geothermal, but only about 20% of the global capacity for geothermal is in the US. A lot of it is in the markets you mentioned: Kenya, Indonesia, Turkey, the Philippines. And those are all places we're looking at. If you look at how we've started in the US, we've gone to locations that have a little bit of conventional geothermal and used our technology to make it a lot of unconventional geothermal. And so the markets we're looking at internationally actually are very similar. What we want to go to at first is places with an established geothermal market, but then 10x or 100x the potential of geothermal in those markets given our technology. But ultimately, every country in the world has geology that's going to be suitable for geothermal development using our technology approach. And so we do think this can be a globally scalable solution.
After the break, Tim tells me about the oil and gas workers eager to find new jobs in the geothermal industry. And by the way, if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. One thing that's always struck me about conversations we've had online, offline over the years with geothermal, and Fervo is that you've been able to take an oil and gas technology and apply it to clean energy. You've been able to take workers in the oil and gas industry and get them to work in the clean energy sector. I recently spoke to Bill Gates, who is opening a nuclear power plant in a former coal town in Wyoming, and hoping to use not just infrastructure, but a lot of the skills that come in that town maintaining a power plant. So talk me through how it's been for you to try and bring in the human resources from the oil and gas industry into clean energy.
Yeah, it's been a huge enabler for Fervo and also a core part of our mission from day one. You know from talking to me, I started my career in oil and gas. I grew up in a small town in Texas and started working as a drilling engineer right out of college, and always found the work fascinating and always enjoyed the people I worked with. And honestly, if it wasn't for climate change, probably would not have ever changed my career because it was a fascinating career. But I got seriously interested in climate change, and it's just not that hard to think through the logic of it when you start realizing if we need to reinvent how we get energy in the world. That does mean a transition away from fossil fuels. And what does that mean for all the people that work in the industry? And, that was something that was a big motivator for me and why I was so excited about geothermal, because it's a very seamless transition to go from drilling oil and gas wells to drilling geothermal wells. And in fact, the majority of the employees at Fervo come from the oil and gas industry. And the fact that we have such a large skilled workforce to tap into and a proven supply chain of the kinds of equipment and services we need has been one of the things that's allowed Fervo to get to market way faster than many of the other competing approaches, in the climate tech ecosystem. So it's been a huge enabler. Drilling is this amazingly orchestrated engineering and scientific challenge. And it's taken 150 years of the oil and gas industry drilling to get the technology in the place that it is today. And there's no way we could be developing the sites the way we're developing them. You just imagine drilling a well, you need technical specialists in dozens of subdisciplines. But the amount of knowledge and skills that have been built up around this activity over the last 150 years is incredible. I was just out at our drilling location in Utah last week and met somebody from, one of our supply companies called Mud Logging, the on-site geologist that analyzed the geology there. And the gentleman came up to me and introduced himself and told me how excited he was. And he said that he'd specifically requested to be on this project, even though it made him have to move halfway across the country for it, because he realized that this was the future. And this was something that he could be in on the ground floor of something that changes the world. And so it's somebody who's worked in oil and gas their entire career, and they're gravitating to this. And the amount of excitement there is among the people that look at this and see that it's something new, see that it can be a huge part of the energy mix of the future and solve climate change and use the skills they already have to do it, is something that just creates a lot of enthusiasm around our projects. And it's always phenomenal for us to visit the hardworking people out on our site and just see how excited they are to be part of this project that's really going to change things.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That is geothermal energy from the geysers of Yellowstone National Park. You could say it's geothermal energy being wasted for tourism. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who needs a spa weekend. You can get in touch at zeropod@bloomberg.net. Zero's producer is Mythili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcast is Sage Bauman, and head of talk is Brendan Newnham. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Thanks to Breakthrough Energy for recording space for this episode. Special thanks to Kira Bindrim and Monique Mulima. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.